Hello and welcome to the Crisis Point podcast. I'm Eric Sammons, your host and the editor-in-chief of Crisis Magazine. Before we get to our guest today, I want to just encourage everybody to like and subscribe to the podcast, however you're watching it or seeing it. That really helps other people find out about it. Okay, now let's just get started then. Our guest today is Patrick Reilly, and he is the president and founder of the Cardinal Newman Society. The mission of the Cardinal Newman Society is to promote and defend faithful Catholic education. I'd say they're most well known for the Newman Guide, at least with people I know, for the Newman Guide, which basically gives us a list of faithful Catholic colleges. And before I continue, I just say, as the parent of now have 4 who have either gone to college or in college right now, I tell you what, it's a great guide. In fact, in our family, and I got this from an older family, did this. Our rule is we're not going to help financially unless they're on the Newman Guide. So If you want to go somewhere else, you can go somewhere else, but you're paying for it all yourself. We'll help as much as we can if it's a school in the Newman Guide. So it's a great resource for Catholics everywhere. Patrick was awarded the Lumen Vitae Medal from the University of Mary, the Hall of Fame Award from the Catholic Education Foundation. He has an honorary Doctor of Humane Letters from Holy Apostles College and Seminary, and the Spes Nostra Award from the National Association of Private Catholic Independent Schools. Patrick's our go-to guy for Catholic education. I mean, you've been doing this, I don't know how long, but as long as I've been around.
28 years.
How long?
28 years.
Okay, that's how long I've been Catholic. So you've been doing it. See, I knew you've been around since the beginning, because ever since I've been Catholic, when it comes to Catholic education, go to the Cardinal Newman Society to find out. So welcome, Patrick, to the show.
Thank you, Eric. I really appreciate it, and great to be with you. Absolutely love Crisis Magazine, and congratulations on 1 Peter 5 now. You're working with that as well, and so, just great impact that you're having.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. So our topic today isn't Catholic education in general, but specifically critical race theory, which is having a dramatic impact on education all across the country, and which means it seeps into Catholic education. So we want to talk about that today. The Newman Society has gotten a number of good articles up on their website, and I'll link to those in the show notes for people to explore it more, because it is a very important subject. So I'm glad the Newman Society is taking a lead on this. So why don't we just get started with the most basic thing? What is critical race theory?
Yeah, I'll be honest with you, Eric. I didn't want to deal with this. You get crucified the minute you do it. And of course, crucifixion for certain people is a great thing, but nothing we were looking for. But it's absolutely necessary, because it is starting to creep into Catholic education, and certainly has been in public education, and is increasingly being pushed in public education. Critical race theory is, to put it as succinctly as I can, it's a false political ideology that focuses, is intent on division. It's the central point of critical race theory, is that the world is divided between oppressor and oppressed, and that dividing line is determined by race. And so therefore, if you are white, you are the oppressor. And there's no getting out of it. You are oppressive, whether you're the meekest, kindest, gentlest, wonderful white person possible. And so it's a very dangerous ideology. And so it's false in that, clearly humanity is not divided by racial lines. We as Catholics understand that people are all individuals, and that race, in fact, has very little to do with who we are. It certainly has to do with our heritage and how we look, and certainly affects our lives and how we look at each other. But, we generally, as Catholics and Christians, try to look beyond race and beyond someone's skin color to determine who they are. And unfortunately, critical race theory goes the exact opposite direction, to the point where it actually rejects the accomplishments of the civil rights movement. They actually argue that the civil rights movement made minorities, particularly blacks, feel that they were somehow given some kind of equal status within a society that inherently in the way that it was structured, because it was developed by white people, it inherently is biased in favor of whites, and therefore any type of accommodation is simply a way of mollifying, racial minorities instead of actually genuinely giving them what they deserve.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy what you're saying about if you're white, you have to be an oppressor, because my father grew up in Appalachia, Kentucky, Eastern Kentucky. And, we'd go visit there all the time growing up. And if you talk about a group of people who are not oppressors, I mean, that's them. I mean, they are so down on their luck, and they have, so many things they're born into that are against them. I mean, they really are. And of course, it's almost 100% white down there in that area, but they have no advantages in our society, really. And so it's just kind of crazy idea that, well, just because they're white, now they're an oppressor. Right. I mean, I think they would just start laughing at that idea. They're like, who am I oppressing? I mean,
right.
Oh my goodness.
And the reality is we're all oppressors in certain ways, and we're all oppressed in certain ways. I mean, the minute you sin against anyone else, right, you're an oppressor. That's really fundamentally the definition, right? You're somehow infringing on somebody's dignity as a human being. And so, that is the reality. That's the sinful reality of man. We're fallen, and there are serious consequences to that. In fact, serious social consequences to that. But there's so many aspects of critical race theory that are contradictory to our Catholic faith. For example, that whole idea of sin and guilt. They would actually ascribe this collective guilt to people because of their race, even if they had nothing to do with what was done, 20, 50, 100, 200 years ago. And that is entirely contrary to a Christian view of sin and mercy and conscience, that we each individually have responsibility for our sins, and we have individual guilt, but there's no such thing as collective guilt in that sense.
Right. What are some examples today of how this is being played out? Like the one I think probably most people think of is the 1619 Project. I think that's what it's called. What is the 1619 Project? I guess I'll change the question to that. And how is that it seems like that's the leading forefront of the of critical race theory. And what exactly is that?
Well, so it's just another, it's really an organized fashion to try to change particularly how we teach about history from the view of critical race theory. So everything is determined by race. And so you go back to slavery and to this idea that that never have blacks been considered to be equal members of society at any point in history. And it's based on a fundamental, what would be the word for it? A negativity, this idea that never will black people be considered equal in this society unless we tear down all institutions. We need to tear down everything in America. And so the 1619 Project is based on this fundamental notion that America inherently is racist. And so it comes very close to being quite blatant in indicating that we essentially need to throw out everything that we've done since the very beginnings, the very origins of the United States, and start all over again, which of course is so tragic. There are serious crimes and injuries to people, including to Catholics, throughout the history of the United States. There's no question about that. That's part of our human condition. But you can also quite reasonably argue the immense accomplishments of our culture and try to reform it. Always trying to reform it. That's Catholics always take a critical eye to society and to culture, but it's always with an aim to improve and reform and renew, as opposed to simply tear down and destroy and accuse entire groups of people of being inherently bad.
Right. I've often thought that the three great kind of collective sins of the United States would be the driving out of the Native Americans, the slavery of Africans, and then abortion. Now, abortion, of course, is, if it's racist in any way, it kind of is, because it's more directed towards blacks, frankly. But the other two are clearly race-based. And so obviously there's a certain truth in, and that's usually the way errors work, but there's certain truth in the point that our country's foundations have these problematic elements.
Sure.
And so where is it that something like 1619 Project really gets wrong about, we probably would all agree that, yes, these historical facts are, there's terrible things in our past, but you kind of touched on it there a little bit. But then what is the proper way to look at that and overcome that? Because let's use the example of slavery of Africans and African Americans today. Clearly, historically, there has been significant disadvantages for African Americans in American culture. I mean, I think that's pretty obvious. So they're saying tear everything down to make it so that those disadvantages go away. What is the Catholic way of looking at, okay, how do we make those disadvantages go away? If they haven't, any disadvantage that still exists today, we'll just say, how should the Catholic look at overcoming those?
Yeah, I think it comes down to that point I made earlier about the negativity or the pessimism of the view. I mean, it basically comes down to this argument that if people are bad in some way, sometimes adopting, very wrong, even evil ideas that have come to them through culture, come to them through parents, come to them, from a variety of ways, and they're personally responsible for adopting these views. Does it necessarily mean that everything they do is worthless and in fact oppressive to other people? And if you actually believe that, then, and you do believe that man has fallen, then there is no hope for any system, right? I mean, that's my big question with the critical race theory, is that if they can believe that because whites who wrongly adopted slavery from the cultures that they came from, and in many ways slavery was worse than the cultures that they came from in the United States. I mean, the way that it was carried out in certain places. But if they believe that necessarily taints absolutely everything that was developed here, our system of government, our ideas of freedom and equality, and all of the concepts that are built into our systems, the idea of innocent until proven guilty, is that necessarily racist because it came from those people? And if you actually believe that, then there really is no hope for another system. You can tear this down, but then the next system will be inherently racist in favor of whoever creates that, right? And I really do believe that many of them, the critical race theory is so based on power and who's in control that I'm not sure that at least the ones who have seriously thought this through and are intelligent enough to see, where this all leads, I don't know that they would actually deny in private conversation that really it's a matter of seeing who's in control and who's determining the system, because otherwise the theory breaks down completely. So that's really the fundamental problem with, as Catholics, as Christians, is we would say that individuals are flawed, and that we can look back in history with the wisdom that we have today and say that certain things that they did were terrible. And in fact, people were even saying that at the time of the founding of the United States, right? I mean, the Constitution almost fell apart. The Declaration of Independence almost fell apart because of slavery and disagreements over what was happening. So, many people understood this already. But, we can go back and have the wisdom today where we pretty much universally understand what everyone should have understood at the time. But I'm sure 200 years from now, people are going to look back on our culture today and say the same thing. And so the people who are arguing for the inherent evil of America 200 years ago are ignoring the absolute horrible evils, like you said, the abortion, the abortion, probably, issues with how we deal with marriage and family and relationships between the sexes. That still is I think has a long way to go in terms of being worked out in terms of proper social understanding. And so there are a lot of things that we can look back 200 years from now and say, boy, that was a sinful society. It doesn't mean that we can't accomplish things and that we can't adopt very good ideas and good concepts and develop a very good system based on that. And I think reasonably, you have to look at the United States and say, what other country, what other civilization was developed in history that had many of the developments and marks of American society? It would be hard to do that. I mean, maybe we lost some good things, but we certainly gained many good things as well.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the history of, every country, every empire, every nation, there's lots of evil included, but some of them are better than others. Some of them, and America is right up there as far as all the good it's brought, even though, there's definitely evil in its past, but like you said, we're all flawed, original sin. There's not going to be a utopia created.
Right.
And you kind of makes you wonder if people are pushing critical race or even want a utopia. I think they just want themselves in control in some situations more than anything. Okay, let's talk about now specifically education, because that's really where this is impacting is education. We know it's being introduced into the public schools, but how is it being introduced and into Catholic schools? And have you seen it, I should say, being introduced into Catholic schools? And if so, how so?
Yeah, we are. So much of the problem in education goes very far back. It really fundamentally goes to the fact that education has become two things. It has become a means of learning skills for living, for earning a living, for career. It's become a very practical function, and which in itself is not right. Is always part of it, but it's become entirely that. And secondly, it's become as a means of social formation, right? It's become, you go back to Dewey and back to the development of public education in the United States, this idea that we're trying to form a particular citizen in a particular way. And the principles for that are usually determined simply by social agreement or by the fiat of those who are in control of society, right? So it's social control of how we look at the person instead of rooting all of this in an understanding of the human person that comes to us from revelation, from our understanding of human dignity. And when that was lost, which is really Protestantization of education, I would say, we left ourselves susceptible to the latest ideology, right? So whether it's radical feminism, whether it's gender ideology, whether it's critical race theory, whatever it is, we've left ourselves vulnerable to those things because there really is no foundation upon which to determine how public education should be educating. The sad thing is that Catholic education very much has fallen into that model, where what we do in education is not all that different from public education. I just had a conversation just the other day with someone who I highly respect as a wonderful Catholic leader, someone who has just done wonderful things in the pro-life movement and for the church. And we were talking about what is Catholic education. And it was clear that this person really hadn't thought very much about it. They hadn't attended Catholic schools, and if they had, they probably still wouldn't have thought very much about it. It's something that we have to recapture, this idea that Catholic education isn't simply adding in Catholic elements to an education. We have this idea that education is really fundamentally the same for everyone, and it's just about whether you add a certain flavor to it. But that's inherently twisted. I mean, it's entirely the opposite. As Newman would have argued, St. John Henry Newman, that a Catholic education is really the only full education, because in a secular education, you're denying or at least excluding an entire branch of knowledge that's fundamental to our understanding of every other branch of knowledge, right? So, I'll talk to people, what does it mean to study math in a Catholic school or in Catholic education? Well, it actually is very different, not because 2 plus 2 is any different, those rules are still the same, but because we understand what that is and what it means, right? The why and the how and the purposes of these things suddenly become apparent, because we know that math is, right, the order of the world, the order of creation. It's a window into God's mind, right? And we need it as a skill because God ordained it that way, and everything operates according to these rules in this order. And ultimately, the most important thing you can learn from math is the fact that there is order, and that it's order that was created, not by us, right? So these are the things that Catholic education should be doing. And when we lose that, when we turn education into just something that's learning skills, learning, preparing for a career, preparing to be a good citizen, however society decides to define it, then we're suddenly vulnerable to these ideologies creeping into our education.
Yeah, I heard somebody once say that our public schools, they're more about training than they are about teaching.
Yes.
And they mean that in two ways, the training, though. Training in a good way of skills that we all, everybody do need skills if they're going to get a job and things like that. But also training of what to think, not how to think, but what to think. And it sounds like critical race theory kind of falls into that training of that. And I still remember it was almost 20 years ago. My oldest daughter was getting ready to go off, looking at kindergarten. So we look at Catholic schools in the area. And it was amazing how many of the Catholic schools in the area, this was in Washington, D.C. area, so there's a lot of them available. Their marketing was basically like, we're just as good as the Catholic schools, but we also have a crucifix up on the wall.
Yep.
And that's essentially all
values.
Yeah, they talk about values. But it was really that, they would teach every subject the same, but then they'd also have a religion class.
Mm-hmm.
And and my wife and I were just like, that's not what we're looking for. We want a Catholic education. We don't want a public education with a religion class tacked on.
Right.
We want a Catholic education.
And the critics of Catholic education will say, well, Catholic education is dogmatic. It's you're proselytizing, you're forcing ideas into people's heads, when in fact, yes, we do accept certain things on faith, based on an understanding that Jesus was the Christ, and therefore whatever he said is revelation from God. And so we do accept that on faith. But what it does is it opens these windows of understanding and insight into everything, into science, into history, into the human condition. There's nothing that isn't affected by that truth that we accept by revelation. And then the other thing is education. I mean, yes, it's training for skills. It's also, when we talk about knowledge and education, we're giving people a lot of information. We're giving people facts, and it's become this idea that education is nothing but fact. Just give them the facts, give them lots of information. And so one thing that happens is that kids graduate from school stuffed, their heads are stuffed with all of this information that they lose very quickly as they get to my age. Because it's frankly not very useful, a lot of it. And even if it is, it's just information. They haven't learned to think about it or really understand it. And so Catholic schools are often, chided for, well, you're all about faith and not about reason, right? But the fact is that education today does very little of preparing people to think and to reason. And in fact, I would argue that public education is actually deliberately designed today to not allow students to rise above to universal ideas, universal knowledge. That's considered inappropriate, right? You're supposed to knowledge is what you see, the factual experience of it, and then how you interpret it personally. But it has nothing to do with universals and understanding. And universals, go ascending, as again Newman talked about. Education is supposed to be all about ascending above the knowledge that we receive and continuing to go higher and higher and higher toward a better understanding of the mind of God, to the extent that we can do that in a lifetime. And that's the whole point, right? That's why we do it. And unfortunately, many of our Catholic schools, by adopting this very secular, practical, informational model of education, are actually, without realizing, and I think in most cases, are actually suppressing the human need, the fundamental religious need to grow closer to God through the use of our minds.
Right. Yeah. If there's anybody who's dogmatic, it's the practitioners of the critical race theory. I mean,
Absolutely.
That is the most dogmatic of them all.
Yep.
And how they deal with it. Now, okay, so critical race theory obviously is I mean, it's obviously not Catholic and even anti-Catholic in many ways, but obviously there's still racial tensions in America. So how should Catholic schools address the issue of race? How should they cover it with, I mean, obviously it's going to depend on what level the kid is, if it's their kindergarten or college, but in general, how should Catholic schools address that issue of race?
Yeah, I love that question because, like I said, I was nervous about talking about race because the minute you do, you're called a racist.
Right.
With our materials, we have talked about, we do have a backgrounder on what critical race theory is and such, but I'm less interested in attacking the falsehoods and the mistaken notions, because a lot of people actually do intend well. They're hoping to better society, have adopted some of these radical ideas without really understanding it. And so with Catholic education, we need to focus on what is Catholic education? What do we do better and why? And if we want to talk about race, which we absolutely should, and I would say must in Catholic education, particularly in the United States, we need to talk about racial division. We need to talk about injustice. We need to talk about all of these things. We already have all the tools in our belt. I mean, we have, a couple thousand years of wisdom rooted in the absolute truth of revelation, right? And so we don't need these new ideologies that suddenly pop up to inform how we educate at all. And that's not to be proud, in the wrong sense, but that's to be grateful for what we received, and to not be dissuaded from providing the gourmet food while someone else is throwing McDonald's at us, right? I mean, we have something much better, and we should keep providing it. And so that, you go back and you look at the understanding of Christian anthropology. You go back to St. John Paul II's I'm forgetting the name of it. Theology of the Body. You go back to that, and we always think of that in terms of sexuality, right? But the theology of the body is all about the human person and the body, and how we look and how we're created and why. And we have dignity as human beings because God has created us as human to be in communion with Him, and He's given us all the gifts of reason, the gifts of empathy, of being able to love in ways that animals can't, the gifts of communication, right? And the gift of free will. And we have all of this, every one of us, and we all have that same human dignity. Now, what we do with it is not always dignified, and therefore we can judge actions and people based on their individual sins and goodness and all of that, but we can't judge people based on their race. It's simply not how God separated us, aside from, it's an accidental property what color we are or where we came from. And so, so there's that. There's human dignity. There's Catholic education has always been about community and teaching charity, right? Well, critical race theory divides. Its entire intention is to divide people from the moment you look at them by the color of their skin. That simply does not work in Catholic education. Not not if you're hating on Black people, and not if you're hating on white people or brown people or whatever it is, right? It doesn't work. Um, Catholic education focuses on reason and developing the mind and cultivating the mind, again, to rise and ascend above the facts and information of the world, to have a greater understanding. Um, if we focus on all of this and we teach all of this in our schools, we really don't have any need for critical race theory. And the more that we do it, the more we embrace Catholic teaching and our understanding of reality and Catholic social teaching as well as moral teaching, then the more it becomes immediately apparent that critical race theory just simply doesn't fit with what we do.
Right. Yeah, you're talking about how it brings division, and Catholicism, the whole point of it is unity, in the sense that, and there is no more racially diverse religion than Catholicism. And
Sure.
we literally are worldwide and have embraced every culture, every race, every type of person has become Catholic at least some point in our history.
Right.
I remember talking about how divisive it is. It's so true what you're saying about how you just look at somebody, and if the first thing you see when you see somebody is the color of their skin, and therefore you judge them either positively or negative based upon that one factor.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's so divisive. Last summer 2020, my family, we were visiting Washington, D.C., and the whole family. So my youngest five-year-old daughter was with us, and all the way up to my college-age kids. And we walked by the White House. We had no idea that they had cordoned off an area for Black Lives Matter demonstrations. And this woman with a bullhorn just starts screaming at us because we were white. I mean, that was the only reason. She just saw us. Here's this white family. Obviously, we were tourists. I mean, we used to live there, but we were tourists that day. And she just started screaming at us. I mean, it was just, there was nothing about us other than the fact that we were white that made her want to scream at us. And that's what results from this idea that every white person's oppressive, and we have, it's so divisive. It really is literally the opposite of Catholicism.
Yeah. And it's important also to acknowledge, right? So when we're talking about critical race theory, we're talking about the theory, the ideology, right? But I'm sure that when that happened, you felt pretty angry, right? Almost to the point of wanting to lash out. Well,
yeah, I was getting ready if something, because my kids are with me, I got to protect them. And
right.
Like, if this goes beyond her yelling in a bullhorn, I gotta do something. But yeah, I was ticked off, and later I had to talk to the kids about it, of course.
Right. And so that's why we do have to really develop a strong sense of empathy, right? You have to, anytime that happens and someone challenges you, you have to kind of try to hold it down, to be reasonable, and to understand that in that moment I was really angry. Well, this is somebody that, for reasons that may have been out of their control, they may have lived a life that was much harder than mine. It may have had something to do with their race, at least historically, because of starting with slavery and working from there. We haven't yet figured out a general equity, right, between blacks and whites in terms of income and life and everything. So something's wrong there. I certainly wouldn't attribute most of it to racism, but it's rooted in a racism that it started with. And so we have to have that empathy. And so that's something that certainly we need to be teaching in Catholic schools about. We need to understand why individuals might be so angry and so downtrodden that they embrace such a radical and frankly completely nonsensical thing as critical race theory. What motivates them to do that? There must be something pretty strong in their lives that motivates them to do that. So we have to be empathetic to the individuals and try to find a way to bring them out of this terrible falsehood, and really, we call it reverse racism. I mean, it's racism, really, critical race theory. And so we need to help bring them out of it, just as we needed to bring white people who frankly were, for many, many decades and years of our history, genuinely racist, right? And I think that we actually have succeeded very much at. So we can do it, but it does require, I think, a real leadership among Christians to do it in an empathetic way that somehow brings people back together in community. And sadly, we're so divided now, and critical race theory just makes it worse.
Yeah, and that's actually one of the crazy things, is that there has been real, substantial, easily seen progress when it comes to white people in this country and racism. I mean, it's undeniable. You look 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 50 years ago, it's gotten better, so much better, like ridiculously better. And so the idea that now we're all racist is just crazy when you just look at the facts, look at what's actually happened.
Right.
The opposite is true. We've become so much less racist. Even in I'm not that young, but I'm not that old. Even in my lifetime, I've seen an improvement in that area from when I was younger and to now. So it's like, we're only going in the right direction. So why are we now saying, no, it's all terrible?
I know, you could look back to the time of slavery, and you could actually justify a genuine, flat out power struggle, right?
Right.
You could justify black slaves rising up against the whites and taking over and dismantling all of the systems and saying the systems are poisoned, and like you can see a certain rationality to that at that time, but it just doesn't seem to conform at all to our experience today to be taking this radical of a position. And so we need to understand why people would be willing to take such a radical position at this time. Is it purely out of self-interest? Is it purely political? I think it is for some of the leaders, but for a lot of the other people who just seem to be embracing it, there is something raw here that we need to deal with.
Right. Absolutely. Okay. So most of this has been kind of bad news we've been talking about, because how it's infected. These terrible ideologies are infecting us. Are there Catholic schools that you've seen who get it right on this, and kind of what's their, if that's true, what can we learn from them?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the, I talk all the time about the problems in Catholic education, because that's really what the Cardinal Newman Society was formed to address those, right? We were established out of a sense of crisis in Catholic education. In the last 50 years, enrollment in Catholic elementary schools has declined 75% in 50 years. I mean, that is a free fall that no major corporation would survive, right? McDonald's would be shutting down and selling off everything at this point, but we're not a corporation. We have other purposes here. So we have to do a lot of rethinking Catholic education. And the great thing is that there are some wonderful, wonderful developments in K-12 education. You've got the homeschool movement, which is just booming. COVID certainly helped that the past year and a half or so. But even before that, I mean, homeschooling just kept growing and growing and growing. And so you have Catholic families where the parents are really asserting their primary responsibility for the education of their children in a very direct way, right? Schools are also, following the call as parents to ensure a Catholic formation for the young people, as long as the schools are helping the parents and doing it in the way that the parents know it should be done. Unfortunately, I think today, we tend to just hand the kids off and wash our hands of the formation of our children. And that's always dangerous, no matter who you're giving them to. So there are many independent schools that have been formed by lay people that are doing just a wonderful job of faithful Catholic education. There's the whole classical education movement, where you have a return to really strong liberal arts, which not only helps young people to cultivate the ability for reason and cultivate their minds, but it also helps them to better understand the human condition by reading good literature and talking about it and dialoguing, and having, obviously good theology and catechesis. And then you have a real reform happening among a number of parochial schools in the diocese. So yeah, it's really going well. And then at the college level, most of our Catholic colleges have really fallen far off the line, and I don't see many of them really coming back, but some of them are. And again, we recognize them in our Newman Guide. We recognize schools with our honor roll, and so we're always trying to identify good model institutions. And I tell people all the time that my greatest temptation in the work that I do is envy. I'm always tempted to envy, because I see these schools and I see the beautiful education that these young people are getting. And you wonder, why didn't we have that the last 50 years? Why was this taken away from us? But, once you get over that initial tinge of envy, it's just so delightful to see what's happening in these schools. And in many ways, I think it's even better than what we had back in the 40s or the 30s. I mean, some of that is what led to the problems we have today. And so it's just great to see lay people, to see parents taking responsibility for the formation of young people. That's really where that belongs. The church should be helping, but it really is not primarily the responsibility of sisters and priests to raise our kids. It's our responsibility.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting when you're talking about that, because the first couple of years, my oldest daughter was in a Catholic school, but then we finally pulled her out and we've homeschooled ever since then. So it's been almost 20 years now we've been homeschooling. And I admit, my attitude often is like, I've given up on parochial schools. Like independent schools, I've seen some good independent Catholic schools that have done good work. But honestly, as soon as when a school is associated with a diocese, I admit, I just kind of like, well, it's almost definitely going to be terrible. But what you're saying is like it's a growing case of that not being true, which is,
it really is.
Okay,
I wouldn't say it's the majority of institutions that I would really cheer for, but I do. Two things are happening. One, there is a broad improvement in Catholic education happening, particularly among the leadership. We now have, after doing this 28 years, we now have diocese superintendents, bishops coming to us regularly asking for our help to strengthen Catholic identity, to improve our policies. A lot of that is coming from a fear of the lawsuits that are coming because of the challenges to religious freedom. Where church is always forged in fire, right? That's actually, in a sense, helping our Catholic institutions to become stronger. But it's really exciting. I mean, we're seeing much improvement on that level. And then in individual institutions, we're seeing, I was just up in Wisconsin, up in Green Bay, for a fundraiser for a new Catholic classical school that's up there. I think they've only been around 3 years and their enrollment is just doing great. The diocese is bringing in the Chesterton academies in a couple of schools to establish high school programs. And we're seeing that, just across the lake there, we're seeing in Grand Rapids, you have like Father Robert Sirico, that name, with the Acton Institute. Oh, yeah. He's now a pastor of a parish, and he's completely turned around the school that he's leading there. And so we just see example after example of this. In Philadelphia, the Regina Academies, where it's independent lay people who are actually being invited by the diocese to come take over failing schools. And they do it, and suddenly the schools completely turn around and the enrollment's doing great. And so there are many great examples. And one of the things we're going to try to do, it's part of our mission going forward, or our strategic plan going forward, is to do a lot more of telling those stories, because I think Catholics need to hear them.
Yeah, it's great talking to you because it keeps me from being a grumpy old man.
Well, sometimes that just comes, right?
Yeah, right. Exactly. It's just natural.
I'm feeling it too. Yeah.
Yeah.
I get tired, but there are good things happening.
That's great. Because I mean, we both know, and the reason you exist is because it was so terrible. So, your society exists is because of that. So it's great to hear that there's really movement in a positive direction in a lot of places. We've just kept on homeschooling. We haven't even looked into it because we just were happy with our homeschooling. So I'm glad to see there's other alternatives, because we really do need alternatives, because I love homeschooling and I totally recommend it, but I also know it's not the answer for everybody. Not every Catholic family can do that.
And neither are parochial schools, but they are the answer for some. And so we need to keep looking at this and improving our schools. All these hybrid options that are developing, where we're trying to find ways to take on some of the benefits of both. There's a lot going on, but I don't think homeschooling is going to slow down. I think it's only going to continue to pick up, because today, given the resources that we have, given the internet, given the access to great experts all around the world, via this wonderful machinery that we have, it's becoming so much easier for parents to educate from home and to actually, in many cases, to do a better job of it. And so I do think that that's going to continue to grow. And the church, unfortunately, that is one thing that needs to change, is that the church still is focused entirely on parochial schools, and our diocese need to be supporting parents' needs wherever they're at.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, I think I'm going to wrap it up here, but before we go, where can we find out about the Cardinal Newman Society?
So we're at newmansociety.org, and we have a lot of resources in Catholic education, and just recently, as you mentioned, on critical race theory.
Right. And I'll link to that in the show notes. So for those of us like me who mostly think of just a Newman guide, the Cardinal Newman Society has a lot more, really helps with education, K through higher education, basically, right? So,
yes.
Okay, that's great. Well, thanks so much for being on the show, Patrick. I really appreciate you coming on and talking.
Thank you.
Yeah, great. Okay, everybody else, just thanks so much for tuning in. Again, like and subscribe if you can. And until next time, God love you.